If you grew up in the church, the book of Daniel probably looks like a children's story. You know the images. A den full of sleepy lions. A fiery furnace that feels like a magic trick. A brave young man who refuses to eat the king's food. We often treat Daniel like a collection of isolated hero stories. We read it as a simple handbook on how to be brave when the world tells you to be quiet. But when you open the first chapter, the children's story vanishes. It is replaced by a dark, historical reality. This is not a book about surviving wild animals or extreme heat. It is a profound, terrifying theological survival guide. It reveals a repeated pattern of how human empires try to consume identity and how quiet, non-anxious faithfulness exposes their fragility. The story begins in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. The text tells us that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered the king of Judah into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. The year is 605 BC. Jerusalem is falling. The temple, the very center of Jewish identity, and the place where heaven was supposed to meet earth, is being ransacked. The sacred vessels, the objects dedicated to the worship of Yahweh, are carried away. They are placed in the treasure house of a pagan god in the land of Shinar. That detail is not random. In the biblical imagination, Shinar is the ancient site of the Tower of Babel. By using that name, the text is telling us exactly what kind of empire we are dealing with. Babylon is not just a nation. It is the biblical symbol of human pride. It is an empire that builds itself up to the heavens and demands to be worshipped. Notice what the text says in verse 2. It does not just say, Babylon conquered Judah. It says, the Lord delivered Judah into his hand. From the very first sentence, the author establishes the central tension that will drive the entire book. Who is actually in control of history? Is it the towering empires of the world, with their massive armies, their golden statues, and their endless wealth? Or is it the unseen God of a defeated, exiled people? Among those carried away in the exile are 4 young men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They are teenagers. They are from the royal family and the nobility. They are taken from their homes, stripped of their futures, and marched hundreds of miles across the harsh desert to the imperial capital of the known world. When they arrive in Babylon, the empire begins its work. Babylon was not merely a military power. It was an assimilation machine. It did not just want to conquer rival nations. It wanted to absorb them. The goal was to take the best and brightest from the conquered lands and systematically strip away everything that made them unique. We see this strategy immediately. The king does not put these young Hebrew men in a dungeon. He puts them in a palace program. He orders his officials to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. He offers them a daily portion of his own royal food and wine. They are to be educated for 3 years, and then they will enter the king's service. That sounds like a promotion. It is not. It is an erasure. The empire is trying to sever their connection to their homeland, their culture, and their God. They are being trained to think like Babylonians, speak like Babylonians, and live like Babylonians. Most empires rule by force. Babylon ruled by seduction. But Babylon did not want to kill these young men. Babylon wanted something far more dangerous. They wanted to remake them. The first step of assimilation is always the erasure of identity. If an empire wants to own you, it has to change how you see yourself. We see this happening immediately in the text. The chief official of Babylon does not just change the location of these 4 young men. He changes what they are called. In the ancient world, a name was not just a label. It was a statement of origin, purpose, and destiny. For the Hebrews, names were deeply tied to the covenant with Yahweh. Daniel means, God is my judge. Hananiah means, Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael means, who is what God is. Azariah means, Yahweh has helped. Every time these young men were called by name, it was a reminder of who they were and who their God was. Every conversation was a subtle act of worship. Babylon could not allow that. So, the text tells us their names are stripped away and replaced. Daniel becomes Belteshazzar, invoking the Babylonian god Bel. Hananiah becomes Shadrach, connected to the moon god Aku. Mishael becomes Meshach, a twisted version of his original name, asking who is what the moon god is. Azariah becomes Abednego, meaning servant of the god Nebo. The empire is trying to overwrite their theology. It is a psychological tactic. If you are called by the name of a Babylonian god every single day, the empire hopes that eventually you will forget the God of Jerusalem. But the renaming is only the first test. The second test is at the dining table. Daniel chapter 1, verse 5 tells us, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from his own table. This is where the Sunday school version of the story usually focuses. We are taught that Daniel refused the food because it was not kosher, or perhaps because it was unhealthy. We read it as a story about good dietary habits. But the text is doing something much more subversive. In the ancient Near East, eating from the king's table was not merely about nutrition. It was a political and religious statement. It was a covenant of dependence. To eat the king's food was to publicly declare that the king was your provider. It was an admission that Babylon sustains you. Babylon gives you life. Babylon is your true father. Daniel understands exactly what is happening. Verse 8 says that Daniel resolved in his heart that he would not defile himself with the royal food and wine. He is not just rejecting a menu. He is rejecting the empire's narrative of dependence. So, Daniel proposes a quiet test. He asks the guard to give them nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink for 10 days. The Hebrew word used here for vegetables is unusual. It refers to things grown from seeds. It is the most basic, unrefined food of the earth. It is peasant food. By choosing this, Daniel is making a profound theological statement. He is saying, we do not need the rich, heavy luxury of the empire to survive. The quiet provision of our God, the simple seeds of the earth, will be enough. At the end of the 10 days, the 4 young men look healthier and better nourished than any of the others who ate the king's food. Notice what just happened. There was no violent uprising. There was no loud protest in the streets of Babylon. There was only a quiet, non-anxious refusal to be assimilated. Daniel and his friends draw a line. They will learn the language. They will read the literature. They will serve in the government. But they will not let the empire name them, and they will not let the empire sustain them. They survived the first test. Most people think the food was the main issue here, and that the tension is resolved. But this quiet rebellion in the dining hall is doing something deeper. By drawing this line, Daniel is setting the stage for a much larger clash of kingdoms. And that clash is about to involve the deepest fears of the most powerful man on earth. Chapter 2 moves the tension from the dining hall to the king's bedroom. Babylon looks invincible on the outside. Its walls are massive, its armies are unmatched. But inside the palace, the most powerful man on earth is terrified of his own mind. King Nebuchadnezzar is having dreams. They are so disturbing that his sleep leaves him. He demands that his wise men not only interpret the dream, but tell him what the dream actually was. If they fail, he promises to tear them limb from limb and turn their houses into rubble. This is how an empire operates. When it feels insecure, it defaults to violence. But notice the contrast in the narrative. While the king is frantic and threatening death, Daniel is calm. He asks the king for time. He goes home to his 3 friends, and they simply pray. In the night, the mystery is revealed. When Daniel stands before the king, he describes a towering, frightening statue. It has a head of pure gold, a chest and arms of silver, a belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. This image is the perfect physical representation of how empires view themselves. Heavy, metallic, imposing, intimidating. Many scholars recognize these layers of metal as a progression of human kingdoms. But look closely at the materials themselves. Gold, silver, bronze, iron. These are the elements of human industry. They represent wealth, weapons, armor, and human engineering. They are forged in fire and shaped by human hands. The statue looks like it will stand forever. But then, Daniel describes something else entering the frame. A stone is cut out of a mountain. But the text adds a crucial detail. Daniel chapter 2, verse 34, says the stone was cut out, but not by human hands. That phrase is vital in the biblical imagination. It means this is not a human project. It is not another political rebellion. It is not a new military strategy. It is the unfiltered, unengineered work of God. The stone does not debate the statue. It does not negotiate with it. It strikes the image at its weakest point, the feet of iron and clay, and the entire massive, terrifying structure shatters. Daniel says the iron, the clay, The bronze, the silver, and the gold are broken to pieces. They become like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind blows them away without leaving a single trace. But the unhewn stone that struck the statue becomes a massive mountain and fills the whole earth. The theological message is profound. The empires of the world seem permanent. They take up all the space in the room. They demand absolute allegiance. But in the grand sweep of history, they are fragile. They are top-heavy. They are built on brittle foundations. The kingdom of God does not look like a towering metal statue. It looks like a simple, unpolished stone. It does not arrive with the violence of iron, but it carries a permanent weight that will outlast every human kingdom. When Daniel finishes speaking, something unprecedented happens. King Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of the known world, falls prostrate on his face before a teenage Hebrew exile. He promotes Daniel to a high position. He places Daniel's friends in charge of the province. And the king says to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings." You would think the tension is over. The king has acknowledged Yahweh. The young exiles are safe. The story seems to have reached a peaceful, victorious resolution. But an empire never surrenders its pride that easily. And Babylon is about to strike back in a way that will push this quiet rebellion straight into the fire. At the end of chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar falls on his face and acknowledges that the God of Israel is the God of gods. You might expect chapter 3 to begin with a changed empire. Instead, it begins with a massive construction project. Daniel chapter 3 tells us that King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. It was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and he set it up on the plain of Dura. To understand what is happening here, you have to remember the dream from the previous chapter. In that dream, the king saw a statue with a head of gold, representing his own kingdom, followed by inferior metals representing the kingdoms to come. The king understood the message. His empire would eventually fall, but an empire does not accept its own end. So, Nebuchadnezzar builds a new statue. But this time, there is no silver, there is no bronze, or iron, or clay. The statue is gold from head to toe. It is a massive, towering monument of defiance. The king is making a physical declaration that his empire will not be replaced. His kingdom will be the only kingdom. He summons all the satraps, prefects, governors, and officials. He gathers the entire administrative weight of Babylon. Then, the herald makes a loud proclamation. As soon as the music plays, everyone must fall down and worship the image of gold. Whoever refuses will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. This is what empires do when their power is threatened. They demand absolute uniformity. Babylon does not care what you believe in your heart. Babylon only cares that you bow when the music plays. To bow is to concede that the state has ultimate authority over your life, your body, and your worship. But 3 men do not bow: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The very men who refused the king's food years earlier are now refusing the king's statue. They are brought before Nebuchadnezzar. The king is furious, but he offers them one final chance. If they bow, all will be well. If not, they will be thrown into the fire. And then the king asks a very specific question. He says, "What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" The king actually believes he has the final word over life and death. The response of the 3 Hebrew men is one of the most profound statements of faith in all of Scripture. In Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 18, they say, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it." That is absolute confidence in God's power. But it is their next sentence that breaks the power of the empire. They say, "But even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. But even if he does not," this is the core of their quiet rebellion. They do not presume to dictate how God must act. They do not tie their faithfulness to a guarantee of safety. They simply decouple their obedience from their survival. The ultimate weapon of any human empire is the threat of death. But when a person is no longer afraid to die, the empire suddenly has no leverage left. The king is enraged. He orders the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. The men are bound and thrown into the flames. The fire is so intense that it kills the guards who throw them in. But a moment later, the king leaps to his feet in terror. He sees 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And he says the fourth looks like a son of the gods. The fire does not consume them. It only burns away the ropes that bound them. When they are brought out, the text says their hair is not singed, their robes are not scorched, and there is no smell of fire on them. The unhewn stone has struck the statue again. The quiet faithfulness of God's people has exposed the absolute limit of Babylon's power. They survive the fire. The empire is embarrassed. But this raises a deeper question. What happens to a ruler and a nation that repeatedly demands to be treated like God? What does that kind of suffocating pride actually do to the human mind? And that brings us to the moment where the mask of the empire finally drops. What happens to a ruler who believes he is a god? The Bible's answer is found in Daniel chapter 4, and it is one of the most bizarre and profound sequences in the entire book. The king has survived the embarrassment of the blazing furnace. Years have passed. His empire has only grown wealthier and more secure. Daniel chapter 4, verse 29 finds Nebuchadnezzar walking on the roof of his royal palace in Babylon. He looks out over the massive city, the famous hanging gardens, the impenetrable double walls, the towering temples, and he says, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Notice the pronouns, "I have built," "my mighty power," "my majesty." This is the ultimate delusion of empire. The belief that human hands have engineered salvation, security, and glory. Nebuchadnezzar is claiming the place of the divine, but Scripture presents a fascinating theological pattern here. In the opening pages of Genesis, humans are created in the image of God. They are given a specific vocation. They are called to reflect God's character and to rule wisely over the animals, over the beasts of the earth. But what happens when a human rejects the image of God? What happens when a king decides he does not want to reflect heaven, but wants to replace it? The biblical pattern shows that when humans try to become gods, they do not ascend. They degrade. They lose their humanity. They become beasts. And this is exactly what happens to Nebuchadnezzar. The text says that while the proud words were still on his lips, a voice came from heaven. The kingdom is stripped from him. He is driven away from human society. Daniel chapter 4, verse 33, tells us that Nebuchadnezzar was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. This is not just a historical account of a king having a severe mental breakdown. This is a theological portrait of what an empire actually is. When an empire removes God from the throne, it does not become an enlightened utopia. It becomes an animal. It operates on instinct, violence, and appetite. It consumes everything in its path. It loses the capacity for mercy, justice, and reason. For 7 periods of time, the most powerful man on earth lives in the dirt. The builder of the towering golden statue is crawling on his hands and knees, chewing on grass. The image is shocking. It is meant to be. It is the complete deconstruction of human pride. But the story of Nebuchadnezzar does not end in the dirt. At the end of the appointed time, the king says, "I raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored." The moment he looks up, the moment he acknowledges that there is a God above him, his humanity returns. He blesses the Most High. He praises the one who lives forever. He admits that God's dominion is an eternal dominion, and that human kings are a temporary breath. Nebuchadnezzar is restored to his throne, but he is a changed man. The beast has been tamed. The empire of Babylon has been humbled by the God of the exiles. You might think this is the end of the tension. The greatest king of the ancient world has bowed to Yahweh. The pattern of pride seems to be broken, but human empires do not last forever. Nebuchadnezzar eventually dies, and his successors do not remember the lesson of the grass and the dirt. Babylon is about to fall. A new kingdom is coming, but Daniel is about to discover that while the name of the empire changes, the beastly nature of human power is about to resurface in a terrifying new way. Decades pass. The great king Nebuchadnezzar dies. In the ancient world, when a strong king dies, an empire usually begins to crack. But from the inside, Babylon still feels invincible. Its walls are massive, its stores of food are endless. We arrive at Daniel chapter 5. The new ruler is King Belshazzar, and he throws a massive banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. Historically, this scene is fascinating. Outside the walls of Babylon, The armies of the Medes and the Persians have already gathered. The city is essentially under siege. But inside, Belshazzar is so arrogant, so entirely convinced of his own security, that he throws a party. It is the ultimate display of imperial pride. But the king is not satisfied with just drinking wine. He wants to make a theological point. He gives an order to bring in the gold and silver goblets that his predecessor had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. This takes us all the way back to the very first verses of the book. These are the sacred vessels dedicated to the worship of Yahweh. They have been sitting in a Babylonian treasure house for decades. Now, Belshazzar brings them out to be used as party cups. The text says that as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Notice the materials: gold, silver, bronze, iron. It is an exact echo of the towering statue from the dream in chapter 2. Belshazzar is intentionally mocking the God of Israel. He is raising a glass to the metals of human industry, declaring that the Babylonian gods have triumphed over the God of the exiles. But the kingdom of God is not mocked. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appear in the air. They begin writing on the plaster of the wall, right near the lampstand in the royal palace. The music stops. The arrogance shatters. The text says the king's face turns pale, his legs give way, and his knees knock together. The empire that looked so powerful just moments before is instantly reduced to terror by a few unreadable words. When all the wise men fail to read the writing, the queen remembers a man who can. Daniel is brought in. He is no longer a teenager. He is an old man, likely in his 80s. He has watched this empire rise, and he is about to watch it fall. Before Daniel reads the writing, he delivers a searing indictment. He reminds Belshazzar of the madness of Nebuchadnezzar. He reminds him of the grass, the dirt, and the animal claws. Daniel says, "You knew all this, King Belshazzar, but you have not humbled your heart. You have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven." Then, Daniel reads the words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parson. They are units of weight and currency. But Daniel explains their deeper prophetic meaning. Mene. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Parson. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. This is the reality of human power. Every empire has a shelf life. Every human institution that demands to be worshipped will eventually be placed on the scales of God's justice. And Babylon comes up completely empty. The text tells us that that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. The impenetrable city falls. The great golden head of the statue is severed. Darius the Mede takes over the kingdom. The Babylonians are defeated. The Persians are in charge. The exiles have survived the fall of the empire that captured them. You might expect the story to ease into a quiet, peaceful ending for Daniel. But Daniel is about to discover a terrifying truth. Empires fall, but the pattern of empire does not change. The Persians are about to use the exact same beastly playbook. The Babylonians are gone. The Medo-Persian Empire has taken the city. A new king, Darius, sits on the throne. Daniel is no longer the teenager who refused the king's food. He is an old man, likely over 80 years old. He has survived the fall of the nation that captured him. Darius reorganizes the kingdom. He appoints 120 satraps to rule the provinces, and over them, 3 administrators. Daniel is one of the 3. The text tells us that Daniel so distinguished himself by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the entire empire. This creates immediate jealousy. The other officials try to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his government affairs. They investigate his finances. They look for corruption, but they can find nothing. They realize that if they are going to trap Daniel, they have to use his religion. They have to weaponize his faithfulness. So, they go to King Darius and play directly to the pride of the empire. They propose a royal decree. For 30 days, no one is allowed to pray to any god or human except the king. Anyone who violates the decree will be thrown into a den of lions. Darius is flattered. He signs the document, and according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, once a decree is signed, it cannot be altered. Look at what the empire is actually doing. This is not a permanent ban on religion. It is a 30-day pause. The empire is demanding total focus. It is saying, for 1 month, I am the center of reality. I am the only mediator between heaven and earth. Look only to the state. It would have been incredibly easy for Daniel to compromise. He could have closed his blinds. He could have prayed silently in his bed. He could have reasoned that a 30-day pause was a small price to pay to keep his high position so he could continue doing good for the exiles. But Daniel chapter 6, verse 10 shows us the architecture of quiet rebellion. The text says, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before." Just as he had done before. That is the most powerful phrase in the chapter. Daniel does not pray more loudly to show off and start a protest. He does not pray less to hide from the secret police. He simply refuses to let the empire interrupt his liturgy. His daily rhythm is dictated by an eternal kingdom, not by the shifting laws of the Medes and Persians. Notice the detail about the window. It is open toward Jerusalem. Right outside his door is the wealthiest, most powerful city on earth. But Daniel aims his attention toward a city that has been in ruins for decades. He is looking past the temporary power of Babylon and Persia toward the covenant promises of God. Daniel is arrested. Darius realizes he has been tricked, but he is trapped by his own law. The empire cannot show weakness. Daniel is thrown into the den of lions, and a stone is rolled over the mouth of the den. But once again, the unhewn stone breaks the fragile power of the statue. God sends his angel and shuts the mouths of the lions. When the king rushes to the den at dawn, Daniel is alive. The lions have done nothing. The ultimate threat of the empire, the threat of death, has failed again. We have watched this pattern play out chapter after chapter. The king's food, the fiery furnace, the madness in the grass, the writing on the wall, the den of lions. The first 6 chapters of Daniel establish that quiet, non-anxious faithfulness exposes the absolute limit of human power. But right after the lion's den, the entire book shifts. The historical stories stop. The narrative fractures. Daniel begins to have visions. And that brings us to a moment that most modern readers simply skip over, because it feels too strange, too dark, and too chaotic. Most people stop reading the book of Daniel after chapter 6. The lions are asleep. The king is happy. Daniel is safe. It feels like the perfect ending to a heroic story. But the book does not end there. It fractures. Beginning in chapter 7, the historical narratives disappear. The chronological timeline rewinds. We are suddenly pulled back in time to the first year of King Belshazzar, long before the writing on the wall, and the genre completely shifts. We leave the royal courts of Babylon, and we enter the dark, chaotic landscape of apocalyptic vision. Daniel is no longer interpreting the dreams of pagan kings. He is having a nightmare of his own. Daniel chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, tells us that Daniel saw the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea, and out of the sea, 4 terrifying beasts emerged. The first is like a lion with the wings of an eagle. The second is like a bear, raised up on one of its sides, with 3 ribs in its mouth. The third is like a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And the 4th beast is entirely different. It is terrifying, frightening, and very powerful. It has large iron teeth. It crushes and devours its victims, and it has 10 horns. When modern readers encounter these chapters, they often get lost. We treat these beasts like a complex puzzle to be decoded, or a confusing piece of science fiction. But to understand what is happening, we have to look at the pattern the book has been building from the very beginning. Daniel is disturbed by the vision. He approaches one of the heavenly beings standing nearby and asks what it all means. The answer is remarkably straightforward. The angel says, "The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth. These are not random monsters. They are the empires of the world." Historically, scholars understand these as Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Now, pause and look closely at what the text is doing. Do you remember the dream in chapter 2? King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of a sequence of human kingdoms. In the mind of the Babylonian king, those empires looked like a towering, magnificent statue made of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. That is how human power sees itself. It sees itself as precious, valuable, structured, and impressive. But in chapter 7, Daniel sees the exact same sequence of empires. Only this time, he is seeing them from heaven's perspective. and from heaven, the empires of the world do not look like a gleaming statue. They look like violent, chaotic, bloodthirsty monsters coming out of the dark sea. What looks like gold to a king looks like a monster to a prophet. The empires that build beautiful cities, paved roads, and hanging gardens are, at their core, spiritually starving beasts. They operate by devouring others. They crush the weak under their iron teeth. The theological point is devastating. Remember what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4? When he exalted himself to the place of God, he lost his mind and lived like an animal in the dirt. Chapter 7 is showing us that this was not just a one-time punishment for one arrogant king. It is the defining reality of all human power that disconnects itself from the Creator. When an empire removes God from the throne, it degrades into a beast. Daniel is terrified by what he sees. The fourth beast seems unstoppable. It is waging war and crushing everything in its path. But the vision does not end in the dark. The beasts do not get the final word, because suddenly, the camera of the vision pans up. Above the chaos of the sea, a heavenly courtroom is taking its seat. And the entire pattern of the book, from the quiet rebellion of the teenagers in chapter 1 to the terrifying monsters in chapter 7, is about to point toward one specific figure. The chaos of the sea and the roaring of the beasts are suddenly interrupted. Daniel chapter 7, verse 9 says that as Daniel watched, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow, and the hair of his head was white like wool. The heavenly courtroom is seated. The books are opened. The terrifying beast with the iron teeth is slain, and its body is destroyed in the fire. The authority of the other beasts is entirely taken away. The empires of the world have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. But this raises the ultimate question of the book. If human power always degrades into a beast, who is actually fit to rule the world? Daniel looks back into the night vision. Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 says, "And there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. One like a son of man." In the original language, that phrase simply means a human being. This is the central contrast of the entire vision and the climax of the entire book. The empires of the world rule like monsters. They devour, they tear apart, and they crush. They are beasts because they have rejected the image of their Creator. But God does not hand the eternal kingdom to a bigger, stronger beast. He gives it to a human. He gives it to one who perfectly reflects the image of heaven. This is why the book of Daniel is not a random collection of children's stories. It is a carefully woven theological masterpiece. Every chapter has been pointing to this exact moment. In chapter 1, the young exiles refused to eat the food of the empire. They chose the quiet sustenance of God. In chapter 2, the unhewn stone shattered the heavy metal statue of human pride. In chapter 3, 3 men walked into a blazing furnace because they refused to bow to a golden image. In chapter 4, the greatest king on earth lost his mind and ate grass like an ox, proving that empire without God is just an animal. In chapter 6, an old man prayed quietly at an open window, exposing the limits of a king who thought he was a god. The entire book is a contrast between the loud, anxious, beastly power of the world and the quiet, faithful, humanizing power of God. Faithfulness matters in an empire that demands worship, because the empire is not permanent. The statue is fragile. The beasts have an expiration date. And centuries after Daniel recorded this vision, a carpenter from Nazareth would step out of the Jordan River and begin to preach. He did not arrive with an army. He did not build a towering statue. He did not rule by force. He healed the sick. He fed the hungry. He taught his followers to love their enemies. And when the religious leaders and the Roman Empire demanded to know who he claimed to be, Jesus did not use the title of a king. His favorite title for himself was the Son of Man. He was stepping directly into the vision of Daniel chapter 7. He was declaring that the unhewn stone had finally arrived. The true human had come to take back the world from the beasts. And he would defeat the empire not by shedding the blood of others, but by giving his own. If this journey through Scripture has helped you see the Bible with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next study. The book of Daniel was never just a handbook on how to be brave. It was the quiet architecture of a kingdom that cannot be shaken.